Imagine you are sitting here with me right now, in total silence, merely revisiting the cold archives of your own memory. Think back to that specific woman for whom you methodically altered your daily routine, the one for whom you eagerly abandoned your weekend hobbies, and for whom you systematically silenced your strongest, most deeply held opinions. You did all of this to avoid causing her even the slightest fraction of emotional discomfort. You attempted to become the ultimate clay man, perfectly malleable, eagerly taking whatever shape she demanded, in the desperate, quiet hope of fitting seamlessly into her socially constructed romantic ideal. But clay, no matter how perfectly it takes the exact shape of its container, always dissolves and turns to mud at the very first sign of a torrential storm. And that is exactly what happened to your relationship. The reward you received for completely molding yourself to her whims was not more affection, not more intimacy, and certainly not burning physical desire. Instead, you were met with cold contempt, a distant glassy stare, and a punitive, suffocating silence that slowly destroys a man's mind. Your ultimate sacrifice was never viewed as a noble act of devotion. It was instantly detected by her biological radar as an undeniable certificate of weakness. This ancient mechanism maps your spine, or the absolute lack thereof, with surgical precision. It entirely ignores how much money you make, the symmetry of your face, or how intensely gentle you try to be. As a researcher of human behavior, I have observed this exact pattern repeated across hundreds of cases. You made the exact sacrifice that modern culture told you would make her love you more. But why is it that the absolute surrender of your core essence was the exact trigger that made her lose every single ounce of respect for you? You have been methodically indoctrinated by a repulsive social lie. You've been lied to your entire life. Modern culture, particularly the post-feminist discourse that currently dominates the American landscape, has convinced you that the success of a relationship depends entirely on the famous myth of the 50-50 partnership, relying heavily on your infinite capacity to compromise and adapt to her ever-shifting emotional demands. You were raised in an environment of participation trophies, a cultural dogma that inherently punished male friction and aggressively rewarded docile compliance. The therapy culture of the modern era has pushed the narrative that you must constantly bare your soul, romanticizing a form of uncalibrated male vulnerability that is, in reality, biologically disastrous. The naked, brutal truth is that your empathetic, accommodating behavior is nothing more than your infantile terror of rejection, cleverly disguised as high moral virtue. You possess a cowardly, paralyzing fear of conflict, and because of this, you have eagerly embraced a torn social contract, a counterfeit map drawn specifically to make you march, smiling and agreeable, straight off a cliff. You do not compromise because you are some highly evolved, enlightened modern man. You compromise because you entirely lack the internal architecture to sustain your own identity under the crushing weight of external pressure. And the moment you lower your head, the massive abyss between what society claims women want and what their limbic system instinctively demands swallows your dignity whole. Have you ever paused to calculate the exact price your masculinity has paid every single time you swallowed dryly just to keep the peace? Do not blame yourself for feeling a crushing, overwhelming frustration and the acute, agonizing pain of being discarded after handing over everything you had. Your pain is completely legitimate. You are not wrong for feeling this cavernous void, because you were systematically programmed to fail by the very environment in which you were raised. What I am going to place on the table right now is going to elevate the tension in the room, because biological reality is extremely offensive to those who prefer to live comfortably inside their illusions. If you truly want to understand the real rules of the game, the ones being played against you while you are fast asleep, and the exact neurobiological secrets of how primal repulsion and genuine attraction are actually activated, you must pay attention to every single word of this analysis. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been told you're too nice by a woman you were genuinely trying to love? I read everything because I intimately know the deafening silence of that specific frustration. You probably think she left you because you simply didn't change enough, because you weren't accommodating enough to her needs. The truth that behavioral science proves, without a shadow of a doubt, is the exact opposite. When you finally understand what her brain actually read in your passive attitudes, you will never apologize for simply existing ever again. What her limbic system read in your behavior was a ruthless clinical diagnosis. Your extreme agreeableness is not a virtue. It is a glaring red flag signaling an absolute absence of leadership and a total lack of masculine frame. From my perspective, analyzing this through the cold lens of evolutionary psychology, I guarantee you with absolute certainty that your passive posture, your frantic rush to ask for forgiveness, and your pathological refusal to engage in confrontation function as an immediate biological repellent. You tried to play the role of the perfect modern gentleman, but to her most primitive, ancient instincts, you acted exactly like the dog that, at the very first sign of tension within the pack, immediately rolls over on its belly. That dog might successfully avoid a momentary fight. It might maintain a false, highly fragile peace. But in the exact millisecond it exposes its throat, it permanently forfeits the right to lead. The spark in her eyes didn't vanish by accident. It drained straight down the sink the very instant you backed down, simply to avoid displeasing her. After years studying this, I have seen the mathematical proof of this phenomenon. Cross-sectional studies utilizing the Big Five personality model reveal an undeniable empirical fact. Men with exceptionally low levels of agreeableness, those who are not easily moldable, who are highly disagreeable when their boundaries are crossed, and who fiercely resist conformity, possess exponentially higher rates of mate retention and reproductive success. Your frictionless existence did not signal deep love or devotion. It merely signaled that you possessed an abysmally low survival value, rendering your presence entirely disposable in the brutal marketplace of human mating. What behavioral science shows us is that nature is absolutely lethal against the male who molds himself to external pressures without putting up a fight. Authentic attraction and visceral sexual tension simply cannot survive in the barren wasteland of your servile predictability. They require the heavy, grounding weight of an unshakable masculine presence. The real trigger of female desire is never activated by the validation seeker who begs for permanence, but by the man who carries the latent potential of controlled aggression. Consider the mechanics of loaded firearms. What draws respect is not the violence itself, but the non-negotiable certainty that the weapon is there, cold, fully loaded, and with the safety catch firmly engaged. It is the palpable presence of a man who could react, who imposes boundaries that tear up the ground, and who absolutely refuses to lower his head. When you are endlessly available, endlessly agreeable, you are an unloaded weapon, entirely harmless, functionally useless, and completely irrelevant to her biological need for protection. How many times have you swallowed your own righteous anger and disguised your visceral fear with a compliant plastic smile, genuinely believing she wouldn't notice your sheer panic at the thought of losing her? This docile, domesticated posture destroys you on a cellular level daily. The exact same behavioral data proves that your continuous, unbroken subservience generates a state of profound neurological boredom in the female brain. You did not earn her respect by being malleable. You merely walked yourself straight to the slaughterhouse, wagging your tail, enthusiastically offering submission, while her primal instinct was desperately searching for strength. The direct, unavoidable consequence of living within this pattern of cowardice, cleverly disguised as modern empathy, is the complete and total erasure of your role as a man within the actual power dynamic of the relationship. In the long run, the individual who insists on remaining the nice guy, continuously ceding his ground to keep the peace, does not win a devoted partner. He earns himself an owner. You become the invisible man, the forgettable man. You are slowly but surely reduced to being treated like a giant toddler who requires constant supervision, or you are humiliatingly demoted to the role of an unpaid personal assistant whose only real utility is splitting the utility bills. You ultimately find yourself trapped in a completely castrated, lukewarm relationship where true, burning intimacy becomes a rare favor, a transactional currency, or a suffocating bureaucratic obligation. It is precisely in this dark abyss that your ego screams out in shame, while you tightly clutch your participation trophy for being such an understanding partner. You are forced to watch, entirely paralyzed, as the woman you placed so highly on a pedestal loses the very last drop of respect she harbored for your figure. Every single attempt you made to compromise did not build a sturdy bridge of affection. It simply dug your grave in her biological perception of your value. But if constantly giving in destroys attraction so thoroughly, why does she spend all of her time aggressively testing you and demanding that you change? The real reason behind this paradox will completely shatter your conception of modern relationships. The exact answer to that question is the precise pivot point that separates the men who lead from the men who are entirely forgotten. She spends all of her time demanding that you change because your actual biological value is measured precisely by your capacity to not need her validation to exist. This isn't some cheap motivational self-help philosophy. It is a brutal, intrinsic, and unavoidable fact of evolutionary psychology. When you step onto that infinite treadmill of demands, desperately trying to fix every microscopic detail she points out, you genuinely believe you are demonstrating profound love. But to the cold equations of neuroscience, you are merely proving that your internal emotional state is entirely dependent on external approval. A woman will constantly test your contours, pushing against your boundaries, to discover whether you are truly self-sufficient, or if your internal axis can be easily snapped by the dissatisfaction she strategically projects. After years studying this mechanism, what I am going to tell you right now will irrevocably alter how you view every single interaction. The man who fundamentally does not need anyone's acceptance is the one whom biology codes as the ultimate prize. The very moment you base your actions, your words, and your decisions on the paralyzing fear of losing the person standing next to you, you have already lost her. Your exhausting, relentless effort to please her destroys your masculine frame, and sprinting toward a heart attack on that treadmill without ever moving forward only guarantees that you will remain the background man, utterly devoid of impact. Mastering the mechanics of emotional detachment is equivalent to becoming fluent in the hidden language of real power. The man with his own world, who operates free from the addiction to validation, absolutely controls the entire dynamic because he functions as an unshakable internal anchor. Imagine a violent, raging storm out in the open ocean, complete with brutal, howling winds and chaotic, towering waves. The ship only survives this catastrophe if the anchor remains incredibly heavy, utterly silent, and deeply grounded in the ocean floor, completely and totally indifferent to the chaos raging on the surface. When a woman brings emotional instability, irrational demands, or wild mood swings into your orbit, she is actively being the storm. She does not actually want you to be dragged away by the waves alongside her. Her primal instinct demands the absolute certainty that your anchor is buried deep enough to keep both of you secure. If you panic, if you try to soothe her by desperately altering your core principles, your anchor tears loose, and the entire structure sinks to the bottom. Your one and only function is to remain grounded in sovereign stillness. Strategic non-attachment is not an act of malice. It is a highly calibrated, instinctive tool that forcibly extracts respect from the environment. The critical error you make is operating like a broken translator. You focus obsessively on her aggressive words and the deafening noise of the wind, while remaining completely blind to the internal structural integrity she is actively trying to test. When was the last time you took an action based solely on your own non-negotiable value, without caring in the slightest about the negative reaction she might have? True emotional mastery begins the moment you internalize that your absolute silence and your ironclad refusal to compromise your boundaries are the most magnetic, powerful responses you can possibly deploy during a crisis. By completely refusing to reward manipulative, testing behavior with your eager submission, you instantly reclaim ultimate authority over your own life. Tell me in the comments, have you ever made yourself smaller to keep someone who never truly chose you? I read everything. What you must internalize today is that your desperation for approval will always sound like a blaring radiation alarm in the deep subconscious of any female partner, loudly warning her ancient instincts that the ground she is standing on is highly unstable and deeply unsafe. Think back to that decisive, escalating argument, the one where her tone spiked, she dramatically threatened to walk away, and your chest tightened with sheer, unadulterated terror. In that precise moment of pure panic, you rapidly retreated, waving a white flag, and offered every possible concession just to restore the fragile peace. You foolishly believed that begging for forgiveness would save the relationship, but you had absolutely no idea that that was the exact second you signed your own death warrant in the eyes of her subconscious. You traded your personal sovereignty for temporary relief, and in doing so, you proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that you lacked the fortitude to protect the perimeter of your own mind. Wake up. Kill the weak man you've been trained to become. Stop desperately trying to decipher hidden messages, and stop searching for poetic justifications for the blatant cowardice you have mislabeled as love. What happened to you was not a tragic accident, and it certainly wasn't a lack of comprehension on her part. The incessant complaints, the seemingly irrational, explosive arguments, and the dramatic ultimatums she hurled in your face were never genuine requests for you to change your behavior. They were violent, systemic audits of your psychological strength. Evolutionary science refers to this specific phenomenon as continuous mate value assessment, a ruthless, silent mechanism operating flawlessly in the female limbic system 24 hours a day. She does not attack you with demands simply to hurt you or because she inherently hates who you are. She attacks you solely and exclusively to confirm that you are immovable in the face of chaos. Think of the massive wild animal aggressively throwing its weight against the enclosure fence at the zoo. The animal doesn't hurl its body against the steel because it actually wants the fence to collapse and crush it. It pushes, violently and repeatedly, to gain the instinctive physical certainty that the barrier is strong enough to keep it safe from the apex predators roaming on the outside. When you immediately back down at the very first sign of a demand, when your fence visibly buckles at the lightest touch of her paw, a deep, primal panic entirely consumes the female. She does not see a modern, empathetic partner who listens to her feelings. She sees a critically fragile structure that will inevitably collapse during the first real storm life throws your way. The grand, uncomfortable secret that modern society actively tries to hide from you has been meticulously dissected by pioneers of evolutionary psychology like Dr. David Buss. By constantly ceding to her demands and twisting yourself into knots trying to please her, you are not demonstrating advanced emotional intelligence or progressive empathy. You were miserably, catastrophically failing the structural integrity test. Every single time she manufactured a conflict out of thin air, what behavioral biology would classify as a primary behavioral stress test, she was secretly, desperately begging her limbic system for you to look her dead in the eyes and deliver a firm, unbothered no. She needed to physically feel the heavy, grounding weight of your masculine conviction, but instead, she found the pathetic malleability of a terrified, accommodating people-pleaser. By apologizing profusely when you were not in the wrong, by yielding completely to her hysterical ultimatums, and by actively mutating your own core essence merely to silence a temporary argument, her brain registered the most destructive piece of data possible. If enough pressure is applied, this male breaks. You willingly became the cracked, unstable pillar in the foundation of the building. Absolutely no one wants to live in a structure that violently sways with the first gust of wind, and her biological imperative violently rejects the concept of crossing her genes with a structurally defective, highly compliant partner. She does not love you because you are a good guy. She respects you solely because you are strong. And without that foundational respect, female love is biologically, neurologically impossible. All of your grand personal sacrifices, the countless sleepless nights spent agonizing over how to be better for her, the personal desires you voluntarily castrated, all of it was computed as genetic trash by the cold calculus of nature. I know exactly what your mind is attempting to do right now. Your logic is frantically trying to defend your ego, telling yourself that you acted this way because you value peace above all, that your capacity for love was simply superior to her irrational mind games, or that she was just entirely incapable of appreciating a genuinely honest, nice guy. It's a lie. It's a comforting, pathetic lie. This cowardly failure to hold your ground irreversibly poisons the relationship, transmuting any lingering trace of affection she might have once held for you into a lethal, silent, and permanent contempt. Even worse, this blatantly advertised weakness instantly ignites her hypergamous drive, sending her primal instincts searching for men who fundamentally refuse to bow. You marched onto the front lines of the most critical reproductive battle of your entire life, holding a shield made of wet paper, genuinely expecting the universe to take pity on you simply because your intentions were pure and peaceful. Biology has absolutely zero pity for weak intentions. If you do not possess the internal strength to fiercely defend your own core convictions against the very woman who claims to love you, how on earth is her limbic system supposed to believe that you possess the strength to defend her against the brutality of the rest of the world? If you've watched until this point, you are not the average viewer. There is a layer that goes beyond this public broadcast, exclusive material unavailable on the main feed. You can access it through the membership button below. Aside from the content, it's the most direct way to ensure these deep dives keep coming every single week. The clinical diagnosis has been delivered, and I am not here to coddle your bruised ego after delivering this bitter, heavy dose of reality. If you have finally grasped the sheer magnitude of the catastrophic error you committed by attempting to mold yourself into her idealized image, you must understand that the path back does not tolerate shortcuts. It requires a complete, fundamental, structural reconstruction. The hardening of your character from this exact moment forward cannot be some cheap, theatrical performance or a fragile technique. It must be the organic, authentic expression of a man who possesses absolutely non-negotiable standards, an unshakable central purpose, and the precise, unclouded consciousness of his own intrinsic value. Your mind constantly tries to decipher the great mystery that endlessly tortures the agreeable man. Why does she cry endlessly over the problematic, chaotic ex, or become entirely obsessed with the man who coldly ignored her while completely discarding the perfect partner who willingly sacrificed his own life for her comfort? Neuroscience answers this question by shattering your romantic illusions. The behavioral unpredictability of a man who absolutely refuses to bend generates massive, intoxicating spikes of dopamine, creating a hyper-powerful loop of intermittent reinforcement within the female brain. It is the ancient, unyielding dynamic of the mountain and the storm. The climate violently shifts, the storm screams with all its fury, but the mountain remains entirely indifferent, utterly unmovable. And eventually, inevitably, the storm is forced to adapt to the topography of the mountain. What truly attracts her is not cruelty, it is the sovereign, unshakable refusal to be modified by her weather. The man who is busy building his own empire, a man with his own world, never places any woman above his primary mission. He does not act this way out of a desire to be cold or out of some misplaced cruelty, but because he instinctively comprehends that both the world and women themselves brutally punish and permanently discard the male who abandons his own path to beg for affection. While your predictable, people-pleasing subservience causes profound limbic boredom and fails to stimulate even a fraction of a spark of desire, the authentic, grounded man acts like a narcotic to her brain simply by virtue of not being endlessly available, thereby forcing her limbic system to actively work for his approval. True personal sovereignty is not merely a fleeting mental state. It is an impregnable, towering fortress. When she inevitably tests your defenses with her emotional ultimatums and her subtle, manipulative blackmail, she cannot be allowed to find lowered drawbridges or open gates. She must crash headfirst into impenetrable, solid stone walls. Look objectively at your own life and answer with brutal honesty. Have you already constructed and structured this fortress to protect yourself from external demands? Or do you continue to operate as that fragile, compliant man who enthusiastically hands over the keys to the gates at the very first sign of a tear? The parasitic dependency on external validation rots you from your very center. It is absolutely mandatory that you adopt the psychological posture where female approval ceases to be the oxygen you breathe and instead becomes nothing more than a completely irrelevant background detail in the face of your massive, overarching objectives. Your entirely new reality strictly demands the permanent, uncompromising recalibration of your behavioral axis. Rigid, unyielding boundaries and absolute biological self-sufficiency are not optional tools in your arsenal. They are the supreme, undeniable triggers of hypergamy, and they alone activate the deepest, most primal level of respect a woman is capable of feeling. When her next inevitable attempt at emotional control occurs, your positioning must be exactly like a deep, heavily carved, non-negotiable line dragged through solid concrete. Once that line is drawn, absolutely nothing, not her dramatic threats of walking out the door, and certainly not the promise of temporary sexual rewards, must possess the power to erase it or modify its trajectory. It is exclusively through the cold inflexibility of this barrier that you physically prove your instinctive social status, forcibly bending the environment to accommodate your heavy presence and ensuring that you will never again crawl on your knees playing the role of the agreeable, subordinate, nice guy. Understand this once and for all and burn it into your neural pathways. Female desire is never requested, it's triggered. If what I just explained resonated, subscribe to this channel. What you heard today is only the entry point. Every week I go deeper into a layer most men will never see. This paradigm shift is merely the biological foundation of the unshakable, sovereign behavior you are now forced to adopt. In order for the absolute mathematics of this dynamic to be permanently sealed into your psyche, we must solidify your dominance in the endgame. The agonizing pain of swallowing this brutal truth is infinitely superior to the numbing, anesthetic comfort of the nice guy lie, but it is the one and only known antidote against your total erasure. Respect always, inevitably precedes love. Without it, any affection she offers is merely condescending charity. The sovereign man who fiercely prioritizes his own core essence exerts a gravitational pull that forces the entire ecosystem to orbit around him. The pathetic era of begging for affection through the currency of subservience ends today. Your single, solitary duty right now is sovereign action. Kill the weak man you've been trained to become, and do it without a single ounce of mercy. This is the sheer, terrifying power of the fallen blindfolds. When the blindfolds of your socially conditioned, romantic illusions finally fall to the ground and burn to ash, the brutal clarity that reveals itself is not beautiful, it is not comforting, but it is the only viable reality that will prevent you from being chewed up and devoured all over again. If you have made it this far, you have already internalized the most liberating truth of all. The problem was never her. It was the counterfeit map you were using to navigate the world.